Vote of the 2018 midterm elections is underway in Mississippi. This is a contentious Senate runoff between Democrat Mike Espy and incumbent Republican Cindy Hyde-Smith. It's a matchup that's been clouded by racial undertones and controversy. All right, because the race has been so controversial, I want to take a look at the current state of politics in Mississippi. Here are facts. The state hasn't voted a Democrat into the Senate since 1982. That was 36 years ago. Among the population, there is a strong racial divide. 59% of the population is white, 38% is black. On education, the 1954 landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, mandated that public schools desegregate, but it took Mississippi and other southern states more than 15 years to catch up to that order, and instead, Mississippi found some ways to circumvent the new system. Across the South, about 200,000 students, mainly white students, moved to private schools immediately after that case from the 1960s, lasting through the 1980s. Two-thirds of those students came from 6 southern states, including Mississippi. These so-called segregationist academies created barriers for entry, whether monetary or through unstated discriminatory practices that basically black students couldn't overcome. They were white schools. And that hasn't changed as much as you might think. A 2012 Southern Education Foundation study found that nearly 87% of private school enrollment in Mississippi is white, a stark contrast to the black enrollment of just 9%.
Joining us now, Georgetown University professor Michael Eric Dyson. He is also the author of Tears We Cannot Stop, a sermon to white America. Also with us, NBC News political analyst and our dear friend Elise Jordan.
And with us, Daily Journal reporter Caleb Badillion. I want to start with you, Caleb, because you've been covering this election and you were there the day Cindy Hyde-Smith made the public hanging comments. And I was very moved by what you wrote after that. You said, as honest and straightforward as I can say it, it is that reporting these remarks didn't occur to me. To the best of my recollection, I heard public hanging as a play upon the senator's background as a cattle farmer, a forced and clumsy invocation of frontier bravado. More bluntly put, however, I heard what I heard because I am white. I've had a limited life experience, and for me, that experience has been influenced by the history of whiteness in the American South. I have no family members who were lynched. I have no relatives who were threatened with lynching. The words public hanging bring no particular menace to mind other than a personal aversion to the grotesque spectacle of public executions. I had the luxury to hear those comments only within the context of pop culture's Western mythology. Not so for other Mississippians, for other Southerners, and for other Americans. And you continue, this is not ancient history I'm dredging up, not an old and forgotten wound I'm picking back open. There are people alive today who are old enough to have had family members lynched by a white mob, old enough to have feared that fate themselves. If we white Southerners are proud of the progress our region has made, then we must honor the sacrifices that made this progress possible with a fresh willingness to risk a new painful education. Wow. Caleb, I thought those are powerful words. Do you think they're representative?
I'm not sure. I've spoken to a lot of people, especially white Republicans here in Tupelo, some of whom were actually at the rally, as I was, who heard the original comments. And, you know, what I've heard a lot, and this is funny because this is actually different from what we've heard from Senator Hyde-Smith herself. I've heard a lot from white Republicans here in this area that have said, no, she shouldn't have said those comments. They weren't a great idea. She should have apologized immediately. Instead, she came out, her first comment when this video went viral, she said that any attempt to make a negative connotation of her remarks was ridiculous. She didn't apologize until last week in the context of a televised statewide debate. So I've heard a lot of people say, you know, she should have apologized immediately, but, and there's always a but, and it's usually, we know she didn't mean anything by it, and she's the best candidate in the race, and I'm going to vote for her anyway. And I wrote my column partly to try and model the kind of conversation I hoped we would have, which is, no, we don't necessarily have to point fingers. I'm not in her head. I don't know what she thought when she said those comments. I can only speak for myself. And I was hoping to model a conversation that would be willing to risk a little introspection, maybe even risk a conversation that may lead us to see things we don't want to see. And I'm not sure if that conversation is happening widespread among white Mississippians.
Well, we need to try. It was brave of you to write that. Elise, you are from Mississippi. We've talked a lot in the last few days about segregated schools, segregated academies. Cindy Hyde-Smith went to one. She sent her she sent her daughter to one. Now, some have
went to one.
Some have said that those schools, because the public schools are deteriorating so much in Mississippi, those are the best school options there are. And others say, no, this is reminiscent of a racist past and Mississippi creating these so they could stay rooted in those segregated times.
So here's what happened. It's an incredibly poor state to begin with. You have these tiny towns that the resources are completely divided between two school systems, and the wealthier students tend to go to the private schools. So the community is divided, and there really isn't, in towns that should have one school, it's completely divided. And Cindy Hyde-Smith had no choice about whether to attend a segregation academy. She did have a choice in sending her daughter there.
If you live there, would you send a child there now?
No, I would live in a place in Mississippi where I thought the schools were great schools that I could go to, but you know, most people don't have that luxury.
Right.
And that's the point. This system reinforces de facto segregation.
But when we're sitting here and judging this, Michael, and we say, how could people do this? How could they live their lives that way? If they're living in a financially depressed state, is there an argument to be made that they don't have other choices?
Well, look, we always have choices. The reality is, however, given the structural prohibition against the flourishing of that economy, of course, poor white people or working class white people or upwardly mobile white people are going to make choices that are in their best economic interest. We can't damn anybody for that, but we can damn a state that continues to have this racial chasm, this racial schism that divides, as Ms. Jordan said, the rich from the poor, but they happen to be also rich white people from poor black people.
Michael,
that happens
that happens across a lot of America. We call it by a different name in Boston and in Philadelphia, but it's the same thing. White people live separately from black people. White people live in areas with better schooling and higher public safety than black people do.
Yeah, it's racism all across the board, sir. You're right. Racial segregation is not endemic to the South. Racism, de facto racial inequality is not endemic to the South. It happens across the board. And the reality is, here we are. Think about this. We are on a television program in 2018 where my dear eloquent reporter has written a think piece that you thought was derived from 1955. 2018, we're trying to ask white people to be more introspective about their own considerations as a race. It is astonishing, his eloquence notwithstanding, it is astonishing that we are at this slow creep of racial progress, that we are congratulating somebody for doing something, and God bless the reporter for doing so. We are congratulating a reporter for doing something that should have been done 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago. To congratulate somebody now is to really embrace retrograde politics. And in the age of Donald Trump, it is, to be certain, a sign of at least that willingness to be introspective is progress, yes, but it is hurtful and painful. And it is the reason why we will never make much progress until we're willing to take a serious and profound look at it, not just individually and existentially, but institutionally and collectively.
But I think that's Caleb's point, right? I think that was the effort. The point was to take a personal introspection and try and create a bigger conversation. And I guess
but you're missing my point. The fact that we're saying that in 2018
I hear you.
is rather ridiculous. It's like,
I hear you.
I teach at Georgetown. I can't congratulate freshman students for being willing to take a look at introductory math. You're supposed to be way beyond that by the time you get here. And unless we're willing to say that, unless we're willing to not coddle, but to confront, we will never make the kind of progress that is necessary for us to have some serious conversations
to that
and move
point,
forward.
Caleb, do you think, I guess I asked the question the wrong way when I first asked it to you, do you think the introspection that you are experiencing or hoping to trigger in your conversation, do you think it's widespread amongst whites in Mississippi? Do you think in their homes they think about the things that you wrote about?
I think there is a built-in defensiveness around the subject of race for many, many white Southerners. And I think when those people are alone with themselves or alone with their family, probably there is a willingness to think to some extent about some of the implications of comments like we heard from Senator Hyde-Smith, but certainly in a public arena, there is a real difficulty and a real defensiveness in getting past the kind of stock responses we often hear. You know, I wasn't there when that happened. I didn't do those things. Those were my ancestors. I mean, we hear that a lot, and that is a problem. And I'm certainly not looking for any congratulations. I think this is
I don't think you are. I think Michael's making a bigger
But
point.
that defensiveness is important.
Right.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is
No,
a-
look, in my book, Tears We Cannot Stop, the one you mentioned, I speak directly to what Brother Caleb has so eloquently addressed. And I'm saying that the retreat into white innocence is the failure to contend with the complicity of white supremacy. That's why we're astonished when we see so many white women who are voting against, it seems, their best interests, or voting with white supremacists, white nationalists, when we somehow exempt them because they're women from that. No. What we've got to understand is that we've got to do what Caleb is suggesting here, but we got to do it more aggressively, more seriously, more sincerely, to say not only in 2018 should we be introspective, we should move beyond introspection to reconstruction and figuring out a way to link our ideals and our practices. And in Mississippi, with the history, the ghost of Mississippi, the blood of Mississippi from its rivers, where Emmett Till died, where Medgar Evers died, where those 3 civil rights workers, 2 Jews and a black person died, we have to come to grips with it in 2018. And the only way to do that is to take a harder look at what we've been able to do and not able to do, and then roll up our sleeves, so to speak, and work together. Cindy Hyde-Smith is a racist, a white nationalist, a white supremacist, and it is a shame that white Mississippians would exonerate her in advance and excuse her for the intimidating hatred that she expresses, and God forbid that she would therefore be elected to go to the Senate of the United States to do more damage to Mississippians and America in general.
Elise, do we understand white Mississippians? Because so many would not characterize themselves as that. They would say they're simply trying to live their best lives. But I remember when Roy Moore and Doug Jones were running, and you had said the young people of that state, the young members of the GOP, are saying, this isn't who we are, this isn't the future. Was that unique to that state? What do you see, across in Mississippi?
Well, I'm hearing this from my young friends in Mississippi who were raised Republican, who have always voted Republican, but see how harmful racism is for the state morally, not just in terms of our conscience, but also in terms of the economics. You look at Mississippi and the stagnation there, and you look at the toll that racism has had on people black and white in terms of holding the state back, in terms of wanting people not to come in and give their business to our state because of the racism, and causing our best and brightest also to flee in many cases to other states.
What do you
so
mean?
we don't have people, we have our students going to Atlanta, going to Nashville, leaving the state. And it is a big issue that I've spoken about with senators in our state before, and people are concerned about it. Yes, brain drain.
Michael, you said something about the structural prohibitions against the economic flourishing in Mississippi. In other words, you seem to be speaking to the idea that there are structurally things that are not allowing Mississippians to enjoy the economic growth the rest of the country has. What did you mean by that?
Well, I'm saying, look, if Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail in Birmingham, Alabama, and his white jailers came to him and said, Dr. King, what you're pushing for is wrong. Integration is wrong. Segregation is right. He said, no, it's not. They had a set too. And then he finally asked them, how much money do you make? And when they said to him, he said, hell, you need to be out here marching with us. So the reality is white working class people have more in common with black and brown and red and indigenous working class people than they have in common with white people who rule over them. And yet, because W.E.B. Du Bois in 1935 in his book Black Reconstruction said, white people are paid something different, not just emolument, not just money at the workplace. They are paid a psychological wage. What is the psychological wage? At least you're not a black person. At least you're not an N-word. When white people are able to overcome the racism that has been passed on to them like heritage, they will then be able to forge connections with black and brown and poor white people together to really have a different sense of destiny in Mississippi. Poor schooling is something that is African American and poor white people. So if we can address the issues, poor environment, the economic downturn, the lack of flourishing that they experience even in the physical geography, the point is if they can can join together with other people who have similar economic interests and overcome the racial divide, the state itself will flourish in a way that will not be possible if they maintain the racial hostility that is there now.
Because all of those people in that state do want the same things. They do want to flourish. They want their kids to go to good schools and have good jobs. Caleb, last point. You are there in that state.
Yes, that's right. I'm here in Tupelo right now.
So the election is happening tonight. What do you think? How do you think this is all going to come out?
I think that Hyde-Smith will probably still win. And I actually, looking at Alabama, and we've heard a lot about the Roy Moore, Doug Jones contest, and Democrats have looked at that as an opportunity, look to that for hope, even that a Democrat can triumph against maybe a weakened Republican candidate. But if you look at that race, it took an awful lot for Republican voters to peel off from Roy Moore. I mean, you even had the other sitting senator, Richard Shelby, say he wasn't voting for Roy Moore. We've seen nothing like that here in Mississippi. The entire state Republican infrastructure is still behind Hyde-Smith. And I think those structural factors, short of some kind of bizarre turnout disparity, will carry Hyde-Smith over the finish line tonight.
Stephanie, can I say this right quickly?
Yes,
it's not
Michael?
that everybody wants the same thing. They may want the same thing, but they don't want it for everybody. Wanting it for my kids, but not yours, maintaining a segregated school system, maintaining a rabidly divisive society is not good for all of us. And as this president has proved, until we overcome the bigotry and hatred that is spewed from the mouth of this predator and bigot in chief, we will not be able to overcome the things that divide us. But once we are able to bridge that gap and that gulf, then we have a better chance of all of us together flourishing as e pluribus unum out of many one.
Thank you to all of you. What a great conversation. What a great, smart conversation. Michael Eric Dyson, Elise
I gave
Jordan.
Elise the last point, and then she didn't get to make it.
Oh, please, Elise, we should close off with you. You are our colleague, and you are Mississippian.
This has been an unfortunate episode that, being a Mississippian outside of the state, I have seen just how terrible it's been for our image. And we have a lot of work to do, and I hope that this is a big wake-up call for everyone in Mississippi, but everyone in America, too, that we can and must do better on issues of race.
Well, we appreciate your contribution to this conversation, and yours, Caleb. Caleb Badillion is a Daily Journal reporter. Michael Eric Dyson is a Georgetown University professor, author of Tears We Cannot Stop, a sermon to white America. I really am thankful for that conversation.
I appreciate that conversation.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.